Swann's Way, Combray II, Part 10, by Marcel Proust. Since the Méséglise Way was the shorter of the two that we used to take for our walks around Combray, and for that reason was reserved for days of uncertain weather, it followed that the climate of Méséglise showed an unduly high rainfall, and we would never lose sight of the edge of Rosanville woods, so that we could at any moment take shelter beneath its dense thatch of leaves. Often the sun would hide behind a cloud, which altered its roundness, but whose edge the sun gilded in return. The brightness, though not the light of day, would then be shut off from a landscape in which all life appeared to be suspended, while the little village of Rosanville carved in relief on the sky the white mass of its gables, with a startling precision of detail. A gust of wind blew from its perch a crow, which flew away and settled in the distance, while against a paling sky the distant woods assumed a deeper tone of blue, as though they were painted in one of those cameos that decorate the walls of old houses. But on other days it would begin to rain, of which we had due warning from the little hooded monk in the optician's window, the drops of water, like migrating birds that all fly off at the same time, would descend from the sky in close ranks. They would never drift apart, would make no movement at random in their rapid course, but each one, keeping in its place, would draw after it the drop that was following, and the sky would be as greatly darkened as by the swallows flying south. We would take refuge under the trees, and when it seemed that their flight was accomplished, a few last drops, weaker and slower than the rest, would still come down. But we would emerge from our shelter, for drops enjoy being on leafy branches, and even when the ground was nearly dry again, a stray drop or two lingering on the rib of a leaf would hang from the point of it, glistening in the sunlight, until suddenly they slipped from the whole height of the tree and fell right on our noses. Often, too, we would hurry for shelter, crowded in together with the saints and patriarchs of stone, under the porch of Saint-André-des-Champs. How typically French that church was. Over its doors the saints, the kings of chivalry, with fleurs-de-lis in their hands, and scenes of weddings and funerals were carved as they might have been in the mind of Françoise. The sculptor had also recorded certain anecdotes of Aristotle and Virgil, precisely as Françoise in her kitchen would speak casually about Saint Louis as though she herself had known him, generally in order to shame, by contrast with him, my grandparents, whom she considered less righteous. One felt that the notions the medieval artist and the medieval peasant, surviving in the 19th century, had of classical or early Christian history, ideas characterized as much by their inaccuracy as by their honest simplicity, were derived not from books, but from a tradition at once ancient and direct, unbroken, oral, distorted, unrecognizable, and alive. Another Combray person whom I would discern also potential and prophesied in the Gothic sculptures of Saint-André-des-Champs was young Theodore, the boy in Camus's shop. And indeed, Françoise felt him to be such a countryman and contemporary that, when my aunt was too ill for Françoise to be able unaided to turn her in bed or to carry her to her chair, rather than let the kitchen maid come upstairs and perhaps make a good impression on my aunt, she would send for Theodore. And this lad, who was regarded, and quite rightly, as such a bad character, was so filled with the spirit that had decorated Saint-André-des-Champs, and particularly with the feelings of respect due in Françoise's eyes to all poor invalids and to her poor mistress, that he had, when he bent down to raise my aunt's head from her pillow, the same naive and zealous expression as the little angels in bas-reliefs, who throng with tapers in their hands about the deathbed of Our Lady, as though those carved faces of stone, grey and naked like trees in winter, were like them dormant only in reserve, ready to flower again in countless plebeian faces, reverent and cunning as the face of Theodore, glowing with the ruddy brilliance of ripe apples. There too, not fastened to the wall like the little angels, but detached from the porch, of more than human stature, erect on her pedestal as on a footstool, placed there to save her feet from contact with the wet ground, stood a saint, with the full cheeks, the firm breasts that swelled out her draperies like a cluster of ripe grapes inside a horsehair sack, the narrow forehead, short and stubborn nose, deep-set eyes, and the strong, unemotional, courageous expression of the peasant women of these parts. This similarity, which imparted to the statue itself a gentleness that I had not looked to find in it, was corroborated often by some girl from the fields, come there like ourselves for shelter beneath the porch, whose presence, as when the leaves of a climbing plant have grown up beside leaves carved in stone, seemed intended by fate to allow us, by confronting it with its type in nature, to judge the truth of the work of art. Before our eyes, in the distance, a promised or an accursed land, Rouzonville, whose walls I had never penetrated. Rouzonville was now gone. When the rain had ceased for us, still being chastised like a village of the Bible by all the spears of the storm, which beat down obliquely on the dwelling of its inhabitants, or else had already been given by God, the Father, who had restored it to the frayed golden shafts of his Son, which fell on it in rays of uneven length, like the rays of a monstrance on an altar. Sometimes, when the weather had completely broken, we were obliged to go home, and to remain shut up indoors. Here and there in the distance, in a landscape that, with the fading light and saturated atmosphere, resembled a seascape, a few solitary houses, clinging to the lower side of a hill buried in the darkness, and the mist shone out like little boats that had folded their sails and would ride at anchor all night on the sea. But what did the rain matter? What did the storm matter? In summer, bad weather is no more than a passing fit of superficial ill temper. Of the underlying and permanent fine weather, very different from the fluid and unstable fine weather of winter, which, on the contrary, firmly established in the soil, where it has taken solid form in dense masses of foliage, on which the rain may drip without compromising the resistance of their permanent joy, has hoisted for the entire season, even in the village streets, on the walls of the houses and in the gardens, its silken banners, violet or white. Sitting in the little parlor where I would pass the time until dinner, with a book, I might hear the water dripping from our chestnut trees, but I knew that the shower would only glaze their leaves, and that they themselves had undertaken to remain there, like pledges of summer, all through the rainy night, to assure me of the fine weather's continuing. It might rain as it pleased, but tomorrow, over the white fence of Tazenville, there would undulate, numerous as ever, a sea of little heart-shaped leaves, and without the least anxiety, I would watch the poplar in the Rue de Perchamp, praying for mercy, bowing in desperation before the storm. Without the least anxiety, I could hear, at the far end of the garden, the last peals of thunder cooing among the lilac trees. If the weather was bad all morning, my family would abandon the idea of a walk, and I would remain at home. But later on, I formed the habit of going out by myself on such days, and walking toward Mes Églises-la-Vénus during that autumn when we had come to Combray to settle my Aunt Léonie's estate, for she had died at last, leaving triumphant in the fact of her demise both those who had insisted that her mode of life was enfeebling and must ultimately kill her, and equally those who had always maintained that she suffered from some disease not imaginary but organic, by the visible proof of which the most skeptical would be obliged to own themselves convinced, once she had succumbed to it, her death causing no intense grief to any save one of her survivors, but to that one a grief savage in its violence. During the long last 2 weeks of my aunt's final illness, Françoise never left her room for an instant, never took off her clothes, allowed no one else to do anything for my aunt, and did not leave her body until it was in its grave. Then we understood that the sort of terror in which Françoise had lived of my aunt's harsh words, her suspicions and her anger, had developed in her a sentiment that we had mistaken for hatred, and that was really veneration and love. Her true mistress, whose decisions it had been impossible to foresee, whose stratagems it had been so hard to foil, whose kind heart was so easy to move, her sovereign, her mysterious and omnipotent monarch, was no more. Next to her, we counted for very little. The time had long passed when, on our first coming to spend our holiday at Combray, we had been of equal importance with my aunt in Françoise's eyes. During that autumn, my parents, finding the days so fully occupied with the legal formalities to be completed and discussions with solicitors and farmers, had little time for walks, which, as it happened the weather made precarious, began to let me go without them, along the Méséglise way, wrapped up in a huge plaid coat which protected me from the rain, and which I was all the more ready to throw over my shoulders because I felt that its Scottish stripes scandalized Françoise, whom it was impossible to convince that the colour of one's clothes had nothing to do with one's mourning for the dead, and to whom the grief that we had shown on my aunt's death was wholly unsatisfactory, since we had not entertained the neighbours to a great funeral banquet, and did not adopt a special tone when we spoke of her. While I at times might be heard humming a tune, I'm sure that in a book, and to that extent my feelings were akin to those of Françoise's, such a conception of mourning in the manner of Chanson de Roland and of the porch of Saint André du Champ would have seemed most appealing. But the moment that Françoise came near me, some evil spirit would urge me to make her angry, and I would seize the slightest pretext to say to her that I regretted my aunt's death, because she had been a good woman in spite of her absurdities, but not in the least because she was my aunt, that she might easily have been my aunt and yet have been so odious that her death would not have caused me a moment's sorrow. Statements that would have struck me as inept in a book. And if Françoise then, inspired like a poet with a flood of confused reflections on bereavement, grief, and family memories, were to plead to her inability to rebut my theories, saying, "I don't know how to express myself," I would triumph over this admission with an ironical and brutal common sense worthy of Dr. Pessipied. And if she went on, "All the same, she was a geological relation, and there is always the respect due to your geology," I would shrug my shoulders and say to myself, "It is very good of me to discuss the matter with an illiterate old woman who cannot speak her own language, adopting to deliver judgment on Françoise the small-minded outlook of the pedant, whom those who are most contemptuous of him in the impartiality of their own minds are only too prone to copy when they are obliged to play a part in one of the vulgar scenes of life." My walks that autumn were all the more delightful because I used to take them after long hours spent over a book. When I was tired from having read all morning in the house, I would throw my plaid coat across my shoulders and set out. My body, which in a long spell of enforced immobility had stored up an accumulation of vital energy, now needed, like a spinning top wound and let go, to expend in every direction. The walls of houses, the Tansonville hedge, the trees of Rousonville woods, the bushes against which Montjouvin leaned in its back, all received the blows of my walking-stick or umbrella. Must hear my shouts of happiness, blows and shouts being indeed no more than expressions of the confused ideas that exhilarated me, and that, not being developed to the point at which they might rest exposed to the light of day, rather than submit to a slow and difficult course of elucidation, found it easier and more pleasant to drift into an immediate outlet. Most of the so-called renderings of our feelings do no more than relieve us of their burden by allowing them to escape from us in an indistinct form that does not teach us to know them. When I attempt to add up all that I owe to Méséglise way, all the humble discoveries of which it was either the accidental setting or the necessary inspiration, I remember that it was in that same autumn on one of those walks near the bushy slope that protects Montjouvain that I had been struck for the first time by this lack of harmony between our impressions and their usual expression. After an hour of rain and wind, against which I had fought cheerfully, as I came to the edge of the Montjouvain pond and reached a little hut roofed with tiles in which Monsieur Ventier's gardener kept his tools, the sun came out again, and its golden rays, washed clean by the shower, shone once more in the sky, on the trees, on the wall of the hut, and on the still wet tiles of the roof, on the crest of which strutted a hen. The wind blew sideways the wild grass that grew in the wall, and the hen's downy feathers, both of which let themselves float on the wind's breath to their full extent, with the abandon of light and lifeless matter the tiled roof cast on the pond, whose reflections were now clear again in the sunlight, a square of pink marble to which I had never before paid attention. And seeing on the water and on the face of the wall a pallid smile responding to the smiling sky, I cried aloud in my enthusiasm, brandishing my furled umbrella, "Damn, damn, damn, damn!" But at the same time, I felt that I was in duty bound not to content myself with these unilluminating words, but to endeavor to see more clearly into the sources of my rapture. And it was at that moment, too, thanks to a peasant who went past, apparently in a bad enough humor already, but more so when he received my umbrella in his face, and who replied without any cordiality to my fine day, isn't it good to be out walking, that I learned that identical emotions do not spring up simultaneously by a pre-established order in the hearts of all men. Later on, I discovered that whenever I had read for too long and was in a mood for conversation, the friend to whom I would be burning to say something would at that moment have finished indulging himself in the delights of conversation and wanted nothing now but to be left to read undisturbed. And if I had been thinking with affection of my parents and forming the most sensible, proper plans for giving them pleasure, they would have been using the same interval of time to discover some misdeed that I had already forgotten, and would begin to scold me severely, just as I flung myself on them with a kiss. Sometimes to the exhilaration that I derived from being alone would be added another, so that between the two I simply did not know which one to choose, caused by the desire to see rise up before my eyes a peasant girl whom I might clasp in my arms, born suddenly and without giving me time to trace it accurately to its source. Among so many ideas of a different kind, the pleasure that accompanied this desire seemed only a degree superior to what was given me by my other thoughts. I found an additional merit in everything that was in my mind at the moment, in the pink reflection of the tiled roof, the wild grass in the wall, the village of Rouzonville where I had long desired to go, the trees of its woods and the steeple of its church, created in them by this fresh emotion that made them appear more desirable only because I thought it was they that had provoked it. And that seemed only to wish to bear me more swiftly toward them, when it filled my cells with a potent, unknown, and propitious breeze. But if this desire that a woman should appear added for me something more exalting than the charms of nature, they in their turn enlarged what I might in the woman's charms have found too much restricted. It seemed to me that the beauty of the trees was hers also, and the spirit of those horizons, of the village of Rouzonville, of the books that I was reading that year, that her kiss would deliver their beauty to me, and my imagination, drawing strength from contact with my sensuality expanding through all the realms of my imagination, my desire had no longer any bounds. Moreover, just as in moments of reverie in the midst of nature, where, the action of habit being suspended and our abstract ideas of things set aside, we believe that the profoundest faith in the originality, in the individual existence of the place where we happen to be, the passing figure that my desire evoked seemed to be not just any example of the general type, woman, but a necessary and natural product of the soil, For at that time, everything that was not myself, the earth and the creatures on it, seemed to me more precious, more important, endowed with a more real existence than they appear to grown men. And between the earth and its creatures I made no distinction. I had a desire for a peasant girl from Méséglise or Rouzanville, for a fisher girl from Balbec, just as I had a desire for Balbec and Méséglise. The pleasure that those girls might have given me would have seemed less genuine. I would have had no faith in it if I had modified its condition as I chose. To meet in Paris a fisher girl from Balbec or a peasant girl from Méséglise would have been like receiving seashells that I had never seen on the beach or a fern that I had never found in the woods, would have stripped from the pleasure that she would give all those other pleasures in the thick of which my imagination had enwrapped her. But to wander thus, in the woods of Rouzanville, without a peasant girl to embrace, was to see those woods and yet know nothing of their secret treasure, their deep hidden beauty. That girl, whom I never saw, save dappled with the shadows of their leaves, was to me herself a plant of local growth, only of a higher species than the others, and one whose structure would enable me to approach more closely than in them the intimate savor of the land from which she had sprung. I could believe this all the more readily, and also that the caresses by which she would bring that savor to my senses were themselves of a particular kind, yielding a pleasure that I could never derive from any but herself, since I was still and must for long remain in that period of life when one has not yet separated the fact of the sensual pleasure from the various women with whom one has tasted it, when one has not reduced it to a general idea that makes one regard them thenceforward as the interchangeable instruments of a pleasure that is always the same. Indeed, that pleasure does not exist, isolated and separated and formulated in the consciousness as the goal one pursues in a woman's company, or as the cause of uneasiness which in anticipation one then feels. We scarcely think of it as a pleasure to be had, rather we call it her particular charm. We do not even think of ourself, but only how to escape from ourself. Obscurely awaited, imminent, and concealed, it rouses to such a paroxysm at the moment when at last it makes itself felt, those other pleasures that we find in the tender glances, in the kisses of the one who is by our side, that it seems to us more than anything else a sort of transport of our gratitude for the kindness of heart of our companion, and for her touching predilection for us, which we measure by the benefits, by the happiness that she showers on us. Alas, it was in vain that I implored the donjon of Rouzanville, that I begged it to send out to meet me some daughter of its village, appealing to it as to the sole confidant to whom I had disclosed my earlier desires, when, from the top of our house at Combray, from the little room that smelled of orris root, I saw nothing but its tower, framed in the square of the half-opened window, while with the heroic wariness of an adventurer beginning an exploration, or of a desperate wretch hesitating on the verge of suicide, faint with emotion, I cleared within myself an unknown path which I believed might be fatal, until the moment when a natural trace, like the one a snail leaves, coated the sprays of flowering currant, which, creeping in through the window, tumbled all about me. In vain I appeal to it now. In vain I compress the whole landscape into my field of vision, draining it with an exhaustive gaze that sought to extract from it a woman. I might go alone as far as the porch of Saint André des Champs. Never did I find there the peasant girl whom I would inevitably have met had I been with my grandfather, and so unable to engage her in conversation. I would fix my eyes for a long time on the trunk of a distant tree, from behind which she must appear and come to me. My closest scrutiny left the horizon barren, as before. Night was falling. Without any hope now would I concentrate my attention, as though to force up out of it the creatures that it must conceal on that sterile soil, that exhausted land, and it was no longer in lightness of heart but with rage that I struck the trees of Rouzanville woods, from which no more living creatures made their appearance than if they had been trees painted on the stretched canvas background of a panorama. When unable to resign myself to return home from having held in arms the woman I so greatly desired, I was yet obliged to retrace my steps toward Combray, and to admit to myself that the chance of her appearing in my path grew smaller every moment. And if she had appeared, would I have dared to speak to her? I felt that she would have regarded me as mad, for I no longer thought of those desires that came to me on my walks, but were never realized as being shared by others or as having any existence apart from myself. They seemed nothing more now than the purely subjective, impotent, illusory creations of my temperament. They were in no way connected now with nature, with the world of real things, which from now onward lost all their charm and significance, and meant no more to my life than a purely conventional frame, just as the action of a novel is framed in the railway carriage, on the street of which a traveller is reading to pass the time. And it is perhaps from another impression that I also received at Montjouvin some years later, an impression that at that time was without meaning, that there arose long afterward my idea of sadism. We will see in due course that for quite some other reason, the memory of this impression was to play an important role in my life. It was during a spell of very hot weather. My parents, who had been obliged to go away for the whole day, had told me that I might stay out as late as I pleased, and having gone as far as the Montvoisin pond, where I enjoyed seeing again the reflections of the tiled roof, I had stretched out in the shade and gone to sleep among the bushes on the steep slope that rose up behind the house, just where I had waited for my father in an earlier year, one day when he had gone out to call on Monsieur Venty. It was almost dark when I awoke, and I wanted to get up, but I saw Mademoiselle Venty, or at least thought that I recognized her, for I had not seen her often at Combray, and then only when she was still a child, whereas she was now growing into a young woman, who probably had just come in, standing in front of me and only inches from me, in that room in which her father had entertained mine, and which she had now made into a little sitting room for herself. The window was partly open. The lamp was lighted. I could watch her every movement without her being able to see me. But if I had gone away, I would have made a rustling sound among the bushes. She would have heard me, and might have thought that I had been hiding there in order to spy on her. She was in deep mourning, for her father had recently died. We had not gone to see her. My mother had not wanted to because of a virtue in her that alone fixed any bounds to her goodness, her sense of propriety, but she pitied the girl from the depths of her heart. My mother had not forgotten the sad end of Monsieur Venty's life, his complete absorption, first in having to play both mother and nursery maid to his daughter, and later in the suffering that she had caused him. She could see the tortured expression that was never absent from the old man's face in those last years. She knew that he had definitely abandoned the task of transcribing in fair copies the whole of his later work. The poor little pieces of an old piano teacher, a retired village organist, which we assumed were of little value in themselves, though we did not despise them, because they were of such great value to him and had been his reason for living before he sacrificed them to his daughter. Pieces which, being mostly not even written down, but recorded only in his memory, while some were scribbled on loose sheets of paper and quite illegible, must now remain unknown forever. My mother thought also of that other and still more cruel renunciation, to which Monsieur Venty had been driven, that of seeing a happy, honest, and respectable future for his daughter. When she called to mind all this utter misery that had come upon my aunt's old piano teacher, she was moved to real grief, and shuddered to think of that other grief, so different in its bitterness, which Mademoiselle Venty must now be feeling, combined with the remorse at having virtually killed her father. Poor Monsieur Venty, my mother would say. He lived for his daughter and died for his daughter without getting his reward. Will he get it now that he is dead, and in what form? It can only come to him from her. At the far end of Mademoiselle Ventu's sitting room, on the mantelpiece stood a small photograph of her father, which she briskly went to fetch just as the sound of carriage wheels was heard from the road outside, then flung herself down on the sofa and drew close beside a little table on which she placed the photograph, just as long ago Monsieur Ventu had placed beside him the piece of music that he would have liked to have played for my parents. Soon her friend came in. Mademoiselle Ventu greeted her without rising, clasping her hands behind her head, and drew her body to the other side of the sofa, as though to make room for her. But no sooner had she done this than she appeared to feel that she was perhaps suggesting a particular position to her friend, and with an emphasis that might well be regarded as importunate. She thought that her friend would perhaps prefer to sit down at some distance from her on a chair. She felt that she had been indiscreet. Her sensitive heart took fright, stretching herself out again over the whole of the sofa. She closed her eyes and began to yawn, in order to indicate that a desire to sleep was the only reason that she had made her stretch out so. In spite of the rude and domineering familiarity with which she treated her companion, I could recognize in her the obsequious and reticent gestures, the abrupt scruples of her father. Presently she rose and pretended to be trying to close the shutters, and not succeeding. "Leave them open, I'm hot," said her friend. "But it's too tiresome. People will see us," Mademoiselle Ventu answered. But then she guessed no doubt that her friend would think that she had uttered these words simply in order to provoke a reply in certain other words, which she seemed indeed to wish to hear spoken, but from prudence would let her friend be the first to speak. And so, although I could not see her face clearly, it must have amused, or assumed rather, the expression that my grandmother found so delightful when she hastily went on. "When I say see us, I mean see us reading. It's a nuisance to think that in every trivial little thing you do, others are watching you." With the instinctive generosity of her nature, a courtesy beyond her control, she refrained from uttering the studied words that she had deemed indispensable for the full realization of her desire, and perpetually, in the depths of her being, a shy, suppliant virgin would implore and repel a rough and gloating brute. "Oh, yes. It is so extremely likely that people are looking at us at this time of night in this densely populated countryside," said her friend ironically. "And what if they are?" she went on, feeling bound to accompany with a malicious yet affectionate wink these words that she was reciting out of kindness, like a text she knew would please Mademoiselle Ventu, but in a tone that she endeavored to make cynical. "And if they are watching us, so much the better." Mademoiselle Ventu shuddered and rose to her feet. Her sensitive and scrupulous heart did not know what words should flow spontaneously from her lips so as to produce the scene for which her eager senses clamored. She reached out as far as she could across the limitations of her true character, to find the language appropriate to the vicious young woman that she longed to be. But the words that she imagined such a young woman might have uttered with sincerity sounded false in her own mouth. And what little she allowed herself to say was said in a strained tone, in which her ingrained timidity paralyzed her tendency to freedom and audacity of speech, while she kept on interrupting herself with, "You sure you aren't cold? You aren't too hot? You don't want to be alone and read?" "Your ladyship's thoughts seem to be rather lubricious this evening," she concluded, doubtless repeating a phrase that she had heard on some earlier occasion by her friend. In the V-shaped opening of her crepe bodice, Mademoiselle Ventu felt the sting of her friend's sudden kiss. She gave a little scream and ran away, and then they began to chase one another about the room, their wide sleeves fluttering like wings, clucking and crowing like a pair of amorous birds. At last Mademoiselle Ventu fell down exhausted on the sofa, covered by the body of her friend. But the latter now had her back turned to the little table on which had been placed the portrait of the former piano teacher. Mademoiselle Venti realized that her friend would not see it unless her attention were drawn to it, and so said to her, as if she had just noticed it for the first time, "Oh, there's my father's picture looking at us. I can't think who would have put it there. I'm sure I've said 20 times that it's not the proper place for it." I remember that these were the words that Monsieur Venti had urged to my father regarding the sheets of music. This photograph served them, no doubt, habitually in their ritual profanations, for the friend answered her in words that were evidently part of a liturgical response. "Let him stay there. He's no longer around to trouble us. Do you think he'd start whining? Do you think he'd try to wrap your coat around you if he could see you there with the window open, the ugly old monkey?" Mademoiselle Venti replied with words of gentle reproach. "Oh, please, please," which proved the genuine goodness of her nature, not that they were prompted by any indignation caused by hearing her father spoke of it in this fashion, for that was evidently a feeling that she had trained herself by the aid of what sophistries to silence in herself at such moments, but rather because such words were like a brake that she applied so as not to appear egotistical, to the pleasure that her friend was attempting to procure for her. It may well have been that the smiling moderation with which she answered these blasphemies, that this tender and hypocritical rebuke, appeared to her frank and generous nature as a particularly shameful and seductive form of that wickedness that she was striving to adopt. But she could not resist the attraction of being treated with affection by a woman so implacable toward a defenseless dead man. She jumped up on the knees of her friend and held out a chaste brow to be kissed, as she would have done had she been her daughter, feeling with delight that the two of them would thus reach the limit of cruelty by robbing Monsieur Ventige, even in his tomb, of his paternity. Her friend took the girl's head in her hands and placed a kiss on her brow, with a docility prompted by the real affection she had for Mademoiselle Ventige, and by the desire to bring what distraction she could into the sad life of an orphan. "Do you know what I'd like to do to that old horror?" she said, taking up the photograph. She murmured in Mademoiselle Ventige's ear something I could not hear. "Oh, you would never dare." "Not dare to spit on it? On that?" shouted the friend with deliberate brutality. I heard no more, for Mademoiselle Ventige, who now seemed weary, awkward, bustling, sincere, and sad, came to close the shutters and the windows. But I knew not what Monsieur Ventige, in return for all the suffering that he had endured in his lifetime for his daughter, had received after his death from her as his reward. And yet, I have since reflected that if Monsieur Ventige had been able to be present at this scene, he might still, and in spite of everything, have continued to believe in his daughter's soundness of heart, and that he might even in doing so have not been altogether wrong. It was true that in Mademoiselle Ventige's actions the appearance of evil was so complete that it would have been hard to find it achieved to this degree of perfection other than in a sadist. It is behind the footlights of a Paris boulevard theater and not under the lamp of an actual country house that one expects to see a girl enticing her friend to spit on the portrait of a father who has lived and died only for her. And when we find in real life a basis for melodramatic aesthetics, it is basically the sadistic instinct that is responsible for it. In reality, except in cases of real sadism, a girl might have breaches as cruel as did Mademoiselle Ventige in desecrating the memory and defying the wishes of her dead father, but she would not have given them deliberate expression in an act so crude and so naive in its symbolism. The criminal element in her behavior would have been less evident to other people, and even to herself, since she would not have admitted to herself that she was doing wrong. But appearances apart, in Mademoiselle Ventige's heart, at least in the earlier stages, the evil element was probably not unmixed. A sadist of her kind is an artist in evil, which a wholly wicked person could not be, for in that case the evil would not have been external. It would have seemed quite natural to her and would not have even been distinguishable from herself. And as for virtue, respect for the dead, filial affection. Since she would never have practiced the cult of these things, she would take no sacrilegious pleasure in their profanation. Sadists of Mademoiselle Ventige's sort are creatures so purely sentimental, so virtuous by nature, that even sensual pleasure appears to them as something bad, a privilege reserved for the wicked. And when they allow themselves for a moment to enjoy it, they endeavor to impersonate, to assume all the outward appearance of wicked people for themselves and their accomplice, so as to gain the momentary illusion of having escaped beyond the control of their own tender and scrupulous natures into the inhuman world of pleasure. And I could understand how she must have longed for such an escape when I realized that it was impossible for her to achieve it. At the moment when she wished to be so different from her father, what she at once suggested to me were the mannerisms in thought and speech of the old piano teacher. Far more than his photograph, what she desecrated, what she corrupted into ministering to her pleasure, but what remained between them and her and prevented her from any direct enjoyment of them, was the likeness between her face and his mother's blue eyes that he had handed down to her like a family jewel. Those friendly gestures that interposed between Mademoiselle Ventige's vice and herself, a phraseology, a mentality that was not designed for it, and that prevented her from regarding it as something very different from the numerous social duties and courtesies to which she had usually devoted herself. It was not evil that gave her the idea of pleasure, that seemed to her attractive. It was pleasure, rather, that seemed evil. And as every time she had indulged in it, pleasure came to her attended by evil thoughts, such as ordinarily had no place in her virtuous soul, she came at length to see in pleasure itself something diabolical, to identify it with evil. Perhaps Mademoiselle Ventige felt that fundamentally her friend was not altogether bad, and not really sincere when she uttered to her those blasphemous remarks. At any rate, she had the pleasure of kissing her friend's face. Her smiles, glances, feigned perhaps, but analogous in their base and vicious mode of expression to those that would have been discernible on the face of a creature formed not out of kindness and suffering, but out of cruelty and pleasure. She was able to delude herself for a moment into believing that she was indeed playing the games that a girl might play with so savage feelings toward her father's memory. Perhaps she would not have thought of wickedness as a state so rare, so extraordinary, so exotic, one that it was so refreshing to visit, had she been able to discern in herself, as in all others, that indifference to the sufferings that they cause, and which, whatever names it be given, is the terrible and permanent form of cruelty.